on the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello everybody. Two words that come up perpetually in our show, controversial words, are lies and reality. Our guest today, Renee DiResta, has a new book out called, appropriately enough, Invisible Rulers, the people who turn lies into reality. So Renee, to begin, perhaps you might try to define these two extremely controversial words.
Sure.
Lies and reality.
So lies, in the case that I'm using it, is things that are demonstrably and factually untrue. Things that, events that did not happen, words that people did not say, things that are expressed with the intent to make people believe that something happened when in fact it simply did not, or sometimes the opposite even happened. Reality. I spend a lot of time in the book talking about the idea of consensus reality. So the idea that we influence each other and come to a process of deciding what is true and what is real through our interactions with each other. And then I distinguish that kind of consensus reality from something that I just started referring to as tornado reality, which was the idea that there are certain things that are true independent of what people think about them. For example, the tornado will take out your house whether or not you believe it is real or not.
Renee, would it be fair to say that throughout history people have been arguing about what exactly reality is and what lies are?
I think that's absolutely true, and that's why the book doesn't start with today. It doesn't even start with 10 years ago. It starts with 100 years ago. Actually, it starts with it starts with the origin of propaganda during the 30 Years' War, the origin of the term propaganda, Pope Gregory and the Propaganda Fide. So the book starts with centuries-old concepts and asks, what do they look like today? What does that fight look like in this communication ecosystem with this technology, these people, in this time?
You are someone who spent a lot of time online looking at the lies and perhaps the unreality of our digital age. Has something changed since the invention of the internet, Renee, that lies and reality, as you said, you went back to the 30 Years' War 400 or 500 years ago, so they've always been around. But has the internet compounded that? Has it made the dangers of lies and the undermining of reality more dangerous?
I think it brings them. I think it brings it more to the forefront. So in past media environments, people either were geographically constrained, right? They formed opinions about reality by talking to people who were actually in their community, people who they knew, people who demonstrably existed, right? We have made-up people on the internet today. You might think you're arguing with a real person, right, with real opinions, and it turns out you're arguing with a troll, with a state actor account in some cases, or as we're starting to see today with a large language model powered account, right? A complete fabrication. So you had that kind of geographical grounding in place, in community. That's very different. People also for a very long time in prior media environments were the audience. They were in a little bit more of a passive role. They could certainly speak back to media, right? They could write letters. They could speak back to authority by protesting. It's not that they were voiceless. It's just that they didn't have the power to propagate information at a global scale in quite the same way. So I think the internet has transformed speed and scale, and it's made us much more active participants in shaping reality, not only in our own communities, but at potentially global levels.
Some people might say, Renee, that many people go on the internet, they know it's fantasy, they know it's invention, they know everybody's lying, they know half the characters they come across are bots or in the pay of one foreign government or organization or another. So we're actually smarter than perhaps people like you suggest. How would you respond to that critique?
I think it's a reasonable critique, but I don't think that it's a matter of being smarter. I certainly don't think I'm smarter. I think that what it is that the reason I wrote the book, and which is kind of a funny thing to, is actually perhaps the counterpoint, which is that it is precisely people who have high degrees of trust in media, precisely people who have high degrees of trust in institutions that actually don't understand how public opinion is shaped on the internet today, right? It is not a problem of state actor accounts or fake accounts. It's just that the power to influence opinions has been democratized in pretty profound ways. And I think that it is actually the institutionalists and the people who deeply trust media that need to understand that this alternate ecosystem has, far more power than they give it credit for.
Is it a political thing? You have many enemies on the right, perhaps some on the left, but it seems as if most of the ire towards you and the work you did at Stanford is coming from the right. Do you see this as being a problem of populist conservatism, or do you see the same lies and disregard for reality on the left?
I do actually have a fair number of weird conspiracy theories about my work that come from the left. On the left, I believe I am secretly funded by Peter Thiel. Is the lie?
Your wish, Renee. Right? We'll take a check from you as well.
So it's so I'm very accustomed to beliefs about me personally or about my work. Being informed by these sort of facts that I can't seem to refute. I think there's also one that I secretly work for the Federalist Society, because once I spoke at a conference the Federalist Society had sponsored in some way. They made speaker websites. There's a website of me, my speaker bio on the Federalist Society, ergo I must secretly work for the Federalist Society. So that belief that that there is like an inherent enmity, that people who describe things are in some way making a normative statement about them, I think you see on the right and on the left, and on the center too in some cases. The book is fairly nonpartisan. The argument that this is the means by which public opinion is shaped is not a normative statement, it's just a descriptive statement.
Renee, there were lots of digital optimists in the early days of the internet, particularly the Web 2.0 internet, who believed that we'd get closer to truth when we did away with mainstream media, when everyone could become an author, where everyone could become a journalist, where one person described this as the long tail economy. Why has it gone wrong? Mainstream media, we know, is also biased. It creates its own realities. Mm-hmm. So why has the undermining of mainstream media, the decimation of local newspapers, of local television, why has that created an even greater crisis for reality and more of an opportunity for liars?
I think so I would argue that it's structural. And this is because, the reason I wrote the book was to try to explain how this particular system of incentives and this particular system of structures, meaning the dynamics of tech platforms, the retweet button creates certain types of incentives, the trending topics algorithm creates certain types of incentives. You want to have a whole lot of people posting about the same thing at the same time. That actually incentivizes things like the creation of bots. The ability to monetize your content creates a need to be sensational to draw an audience, right? That is an incentive structure. So the same way that Chomsky wrote about how incentive structures drove particular types of outputs in mass media in the 1980s, arguing that a need to produce content that advertisers would support, a need to keep government sources close, a need to demonize the other so that you always had a villain at the ready to create a story. He wrote the book, Manufacturing Consent, to try to explain how a particular system of incentives led to a particular type of media and outputs. My goal with this was basically say, here is how the system of incentives works today, and here are the outputs that we see as a result.
Is there any nostalgia in your work, in the book, about a moment in history where there were fewer truths? Fewer lies, more truth? That was a Freudian do you look back at the age of mainstream media, of mainstream industrial media in the post-war age in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, where the media representation of the world was, if not truth itself, certainly, to borrow a word from Colbert, truer.
Truer. I think, to relate it back to, to your last question, the power to create reality has been democratized. The power to create media to serve a very particular niche has been democratized. Anyone can do it. Anyone who is motivated can do it, and that's great. The challenge is when the incentives also drive people to create dissensus, where one of the ways that they monetize is by demonizing other people or by attacking other people, then what we get is not a public square where we have deliberative conversations and come to some form of consensus. What we get is instead this sort of constant warring, right? This is why the culture wars are so heated on the internet. There is no winning them. There is always going to be some new issue to fight about, and there's always going to be some group to demonize, and that is why I think you see so much time spent, on those topics. What happened in prior media eras was that you did have fewer voices. I think it is also important to note that there is a difference between investigative journalism and commentary. And I think that the internet has lent itself to a proliferation of commentary, but not necessarily fact-finding. So back a century ago, there was a very fragmented media ecosystem. There were things like yellow journalism. Going back to Pope Gregory and the 30 Years' War, there were the pamphleteering wars. People were constantly writing crazy things about each other. There were things that you could not publish in a newspaper today that were published just attacking, brazenly attacking other people. That's not a problem per se. It's just that when you get to the professionalization of journalism, one of the reasons that happens is actually that business people in particular want verified facts. And so journalism becomes this source of friction in a sense, where before something goes out in a reputable outlet, someone somewhere has theoretically tried to fact check it. And so you are operating from a common base of fact, as opposed to, there's that meme of, gosh, I'm trying to remember, it's from The Watchmen, source, I made it up, the model, Dr. Manhattan, there we go, in which you have the idea that, well, if I want to rile somebody up on the internet, I can just say something and boom, there it is. It's going to be true for a particular group of people. But that friction process, that process of trying to verify whether the thing actually happened, nobody is responsible for that anymore.
Renee, doesn't mainstream media also fall into the same traps? If you switch on MSNBC and then switch on Fox News, this is still media from above with professional journalists, although maybe the word journalist might be an exaggeration. And their representation of reality, particularly when it comes to contemporary American politics, the coverage of Trump, for example, or Biden, is entirely different. So it's not just the internet that's a problem in terms of our crisis of truth, is it? Our crisis of reality?
No, it's not. It's that people are on the internet, right? And that's why we pay attention to it. The same way as when people were on, largely learning news or getting news from their TV, Chomsky wrote Manufacturing Consent. I think that we have a responsibility to be informed about what the incentives of our ecosystem are, because that's what makes us more informed consumers when we encounter it.
I'm not clear on that response. I mean, the journalists on MSNBC or Fox are also representing their own version of reality. Some of them might claim they believe it's true. Sometimes it doesn't seem as if that's the case. That both sides seem to have a highly conspiratorial version of the world. You have individuals, almost secular preachers, claiming to represent truth and telling their viewers, their listeners, what truth actually is. How's that different from the internet, from social media and democratized content?
I don't think it necessarily is. I think one of the interesting dynamics is, where is the audience going, right? Which form of media is ascendant? Is it cable news and that delivery mechanism? Fox still has huge audiences. But at the same time, I think as people are moving away from following television in quite the same way, it's important to understand the rise of what it looks like on the internet. I am not a big fan of cable news networks. I think in many ways that model of hyper-partisan news channels that cable news pioneered was deeply destructive in a lot of ways. I think it is important to not, by criticizing the internet or by criticizing or explaining the mechanisms of propaganda on the internet, I am not being nostalgic or suggesting that the cable news ecosystem is the, incredible alternative of, the sort of single source of truth there.
But might newspapers be, whether they're conservative ones like the Wall Street Journal or more liberal like the Washington Post, New York Times, international like the FT, are they a better model?
I think that their reporting pages are, yes. So I think that the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Associated Press, Reuters, these are entities that have incredible investigative journalism capacity. Do they make mistakes? Of course, sometimes they do. And when they do, you see corrections. You hope you see corrections anyway. But they do have journalists on the ground in regions breaking news, and that is not something that, the way that happens on social media is you will occasionally have a person who happens to be on the ground and can take camera footage in that moment and share it. But oftentimes what you see happening is that the interpretation of what that uploaded video is sort of immediately taken over by a commentariat, and it's not necessarily put out, the vetting doesn't necessarily happen. And I think that that process of investigative journalism is something that we haven't replicated through small-scale citizen journalism quite yet.
Renee, you mentioned Noam Chomsky, a man of the left, unashamedly, very proud man of the left, very influenced, I think, by other early 20th century Marxists like Antonio Gramsci, the Italian critic of the state, or certainly the information state. And people like Gramsci argued that we've always had invisible rulers. They would have been the families, the corporations, the boards controlling the large newspapers and television stations, the Berlusconis of the 20th century. Of course, Berlusconi just died, the Rupert Murdochs of the 20th century. In your book, Invisible Rulers, the people who turn lies into reality, are new rulers, at least in your view, the digital invisible rulers, are they different from the Berlusconis and the Murdochs of the 20th century?
I think it's happening at a much smaller and more fragmented scale. The term invisible rulers comes from Edward Bernays, comes from the book Propaganda in 1929. Interestingly, Chomsky, Manufacture and Consent, that term comes from Walter Lippmann, a contemporary of Bernays, again in the 1920s, 1930s. The reason I wanted, perhaps much like Chomsky did, to take a term and pull it into the future is actually to ask the question, what happened in that century? Chomsky points back to Lippmann and says this is coming at a time when he believes that it is actually the obligation of the state to manufacture consent, right? There is a series of engagements called the Lippmann-Dewey debates where they're debating about whether it is actually necessary in a democratic society to have the government engaging with media in that way. It's an incredible debate, incredible series of debates, because Dewey in particular is arguing, no, it's the job of journalists to be independent and to inform. So there's that idealism there, but he can't quite get to the question of how. So looking at Bernays, at invisible rulers, in that phrase from the 1920s, what he says is there are invisible rulers who control the destinies of millions. Our minds are made up, not necessarily by people that we've heard of, but by other people who are behind them, paraphrasing the second sentence there. And what he is referring to is the idea that you can shape public opinion by appealing to people in their identity, right? And he talks a little bit about creating demand for cigarettes among women. They want to be liberated, saying that smoking is a form of liberation becomes a means to try to create a moment, a shift in the culture by appealing to people in their identity. The thing that's so interesting about invisible rulers in Bernays is that he's actually talking not only about people who promote ideologies, he's not even focusing exclusively on the political, he's also saying you can actually just create demand for products. And I thought, this is very interesting because today what you see so often is influencers who have the reach of media, who have a deeply intimate relationship with their audience. And so the interesting thing to look at is that the reason the rise of the influencer ecosystem came about was because companies began to believe that they could sell products to their audiences. They were seen as a marketing tool. And then politicians gradually realized that they can sell ideologies to audiences as well. So you see the evolution of this figure, like who is the opinion shaper of the day? And that's what I wanted to write about. What does that look like 100 years in the future?
Bernays, of course, was perhaps the most influential father of modern advertising. He also, I think, was the nephew of Sigmund Freud.
Yes.
How important was, I'm not sure if Bernays was a Freudian, but how important was the subconscious in his analysis, and how important is it today? Are our invisible rulers, are they in their own way putting us all on the couch, getting into our heads?
It's an interesting question, because when you see an influencer who is highly effective, you know, what I see, the person who is highly effective to me is not necessarily the same as highly effective to you, right? It's very much an appeal to what kind of content do I like to see? How do I want it presented? Who am I in that moment? Who are they appealing to? Is it me as a mom? Is it me as a woman? Is it me as a person who likes gardening? You know, you name it. There's sort of different facets of your identity. But the interesting, I think, dynamic there is that there's a sort of almost parasocial relationship that forms where people begin to feel like they know the influencer. They begin to feel like they're engaging with somebody who is a friend. It doesn't feel like media at all. It has the reach of media. It has the potential for influence of media, but it doesn't have that, it's not clearly branded as media. It doesn't feel like you're receiving an advertisement. It doesn't feel like you're receiving a formal message. It feels like you're having a conversation with a friend. And so one of the things I try to talk about in the book is that even through the age of broadcast media, it wasn't that people formed opinions because they saw something on the television. It was that they saw something on the television and then they went and they talked about it with their friends. And that process is now happening kind of all in one place. It's a really interesting consolidation. The thing that is media is evolving into this very different, much more personalized form. And again, I think that is a thing that is important to understand, because it does appeal to us on a very different, we have a very different psychological relationship to it than we would if we saw an advertisement, thought of something as media, or thought of a person as a celebrity who's a little bit out of our reach.
So the church-state division between content and advertising is broken down. The subtitle of your book, Invisible Rulers, is The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. Could you give me a couple of examples of these people, these influencers who are indeed today in our digital age turning lies into reality? Sure.
So I spend a bit of time in the context of the 2020 election. There's a chapter in there on what happened in 2020. And one thing that you see is that media is reporting on things that people on the internet are talking about. So it is not, people on the internet are not discussing what they saw in the news. That happens afterwards. The media reports on what people online are saying, and then after they've written the article, people online share the article and talk about it again. So the way that this happens is you see kind of ordinary individuals who have these relationships to influencers. And we'll just use the example of the kind of delegitimization campaigns that were happening in 2020, where they'll take a picture of, there was ballots that were in a dumpster. I think it was in Sonoma. I think it was here in California. And these were ballots that were old ballots that had been disposed of. That is why they were in the dumpster. But somebody took a picture of them, posted it to Twitter, and then I think also emailed it to a few kind of, right-wing blogs, and tagged in a few influencers. And what you see happen is this, this process by which a claim is made. These people have been talking about how the election is going to be stolen and mail-in ballots are not secure for quite some time. And so now all of a sudden they have an interesting image that is serving as a piece of evidence for that claim. So they've already made the determination, right? They already think the election is going to be stolen. They already think mail-in ballots are not secure. So this is not looking at that evidence and making that determination. They've already made that determination. So this is like kind of backfilling. Here's the proof.
I understand, but who are these people? Is it an organization? Is it a spontaneous thing? Is it controlled from Moscow, from Beijing, from Washington, D.C.?
So what happens in those moments is that the influencer sees that image and then tweets it and says big if true. And then the next influencer who's ideologically aligned picks it up, and then the next and the next and the next. And what you start to see happen is through that repetition, through that sharing, people then begin to share it as well, and they become really invested in the story. So that's the process by which something makes it up to the media today. It is that process of influencers and crowds kind of deciding that something is real, and algorithms coming in and giving it a bit of a boost, right? As something starts to trend, it becomes a big trend. Is that what you're asking?
Well, I'm looking for names. Two people come to mind in particular in the way you're describing this. Elon Musk, who now, of course, not only is an influencer, but owns the platform X, and Donald Trump, who of course always comes up in these sorts of conversations,
Yeah.
always says stuff like that.
But it starts smaller, right? They get to it because they're seeing it in their feeds
so
also.
it filters upwards. But
Yes.
my question is, there seems to be without wishing to sound too pretentious or philosophical, there seems to be a shift in ontologies. People are thinking about the world in different ways. Now, we can blame the internet, we can blame capitalism, we can blame all sorts of things, but it nonetheless is rooted in an ontological shift in how people think about reality. Is that fair?
Yes, I think it is. There was, going back to Lippmann, who we were just talking about, the idea of manufacturing consent. He says that the reason the government has to do it, his argument, is that people live in the same world, but they think and feel in different ones, right? And what he's describing there is your set of experiences shapes how you see the world, and what I think the internet has done, or maybe accomplished, depending on how you see it, is that you can find people like you all over the world who are going to validate you, tell you that your belief is accurate, and go to war with you over it, right? And that shift has, I think, moved people much more into a feeling of deep entrenchment, where once your group decides that something is true, it is very, very hard to challenge it or to make common ground with another group that you see as being an enemy. And that, I think, is a pretty profound shift. The idea that not only does your neighbor have a different opinion, but that makes them terrible, actually, has been very normalized today. And I think that is a cost of the way that we engage on social media, shifting norms back in the real world as well.
Renee, what are we going to do about this? One person who blurbed your book, who loved it, is the very influential NYU's writer, best-selling writer, Jonathan Haidt, has just written a book, An Age of Anxiety, which suggests perhaps that we need to control kids' use of social media. The Surgeon General's just come out with a warning suggesting that social media should come for kids with health warning like cigarettes or alcohol. You bring up the Dewey Lippmann debates about media at the beginning of the 20th century. Are you suggesting that there needs to be more regulation? Should, like with food, for example, or alcohol, should media come with an official stamp of approval?
I don't think that works. I feel like I'm far more of just a pragmatist above any kind of strong ideological alignment, to be honest, and I don't think that works. I think that you can do it to help provide calibration for people. I think that there are some of these sites that try to put media outlets on grids, right, left. You see sometimes these sort of 2x2s that try to help people see where things are situated, but it's so variable. Sometimes within the same outlet, the Wall Street Journal, the editorial page skews significantly conservative. The paper itself is maybe moderate to center right. Depending on which page you're reading, you have a different tone. I think where I am most interested as far as a solution standpoint is actually asking the question of when content is curated for you, when everything is algorithmically ranked, when what you see is determined by an algorithm deciding that you are likely to like it, and then when you engage with it, you feed that. I do think that there's some interesting questions related to, can you create bridging can you use design? Can you use, when you think about leveraging the system you have, can you use design to bring people back more into an environment where you can come to consensus? So by that, that might be everything from what's called injecting friction. So let's say you're about to send your tweet to that, person you hate over there, and you type it in, you've got some expletives or some hot language. It just kind of gives you a little nudge that says, most people don't talk like this on our platform, or are you sure you want to send this? And you still can.
Renee, you have 3 small kids. Is that the kind of language you use with your kids?
I mean, that's the kind of thing that they can prompt, right?
Before they go out into the playground, not to insult anyone. Isn't it treating everyone like children?
You can click the button and send it anyway, though, right? I mean, it's the purpose of the friction is not to tell you you can't do it. You can certainly do it. You can go ahead and hit that button and just be like, yeah, F them, I just said it. And that's this. But did you ask, what do I tell my kids? I do tell my kids that you don't have to go from 0 to punching somebody, right? There's there's ways that we behave in society, and I think that putting some of those offline norms back into the online environment might actually be healthier, right? Look, I have neighbors who I don't agree with. I have neighbors across the political spectrum. I don't go to the barbecue and start screaming at them, I just have you wouldn't be invited back. Yes. So
Renee, the one thing that we haven't brought up, and I want to end with this, is big media, big tech, which has essentially replaced media. With the decline of newspapers and television, it's the Googles, the Facebooks, the Apples, the Amazons of the world that now control media. What about their responsibility? You've noted that perhaps it might be a bit too chilling to have government-regulated media. We have a media increasingly infested, dominated by advertising. You brought up Renee's earlier. The reason why Google, for example, is a $2 trillion company is because it's the dominant advertising platform in the world. Do the big media companies, the big tech companies like Google in particular, perhaps Facebook, do they have a responsibility to address the way in which we now have, some people might argue they are our invisible rulers, but do they have a responsibility to try to protect us from the invisible rulers you warn about in your book?
I don't know that it's a responsibility to protect us, but I think that they have an ethical obligation to think about the impact of what their products do. I think that this is seen as controversial if you view it through the lens of the US culture war, but I think it's important to keep in mind that these are global platforms and that the designs that they come up with, the ways that algorithms curate and recommend, the advertising model incentive structure of the platforms has implications globally. You might recall a few years back, maybe close to a decade ago now, you had Facebook implicated in a genocide in Myanmar, right? When the government began to create pages to rile up and incite violence against people. Now, the question of what does Facebook do in that situation in 2015 was, there was some scrambling to try to figure out how do you point out that the platform has an obligation when its tools are being misused in this way. There was a time when ISIS was very popular on Twitter, again, also around 2015. And what was very interesting about that was that if you followed one account, Twitter recommended a bunch more. And so not only was the platform allowing these accounts that were, kind of calling for violence to remain on the platform, it was actually proactively pushing out more. So I think there are questions related to how do we quantify a harm, right? What do we mean when we say something is harmful or detrimental to society? In the same way that we think about regulation to minimize negative externalities like pollution, I do think it's important to see social media platforms that have, where you have given everybody the ability to be, to be profoundly influential, to shape public opinion. There are at times certain topic areas where thinking more carefully about the ethics of proactively recommending something is absolutely a responsibility they should have.
Although conservatives don't trust the Googles and the Facebooks of the world. In fact, there's a case pending in the Supreme Court about whether or not Google and Facebook have a right to curate their content. I think Texas and Florida are arguing that they shouldn't because they don't trust the people who run these big companies. As conservatives, they think that they're progressives. You and I are talking in San Francisco, the home, at least from a conservative perspective, of progressive thought. can we come up with anything? I mean, isn't the government ultimately a more neutral platform than big tech for regulating this stuff?
It's a really interesting question. One of my colleagues at Stanford Law framed it as your opinion on this falls on, do you think tyranny or chaos is worse? Would you rather have a more tightly controlled system, right, where there's potential for tyranny, or would you rather have a complete free-for-all where there is, chaos? And I think this is actually quite a reasonable framing, right, because it speaks to there not being one necessarily right answer about who is responsible, but that series of trade-offs. Again, just emphasizing that these are global platforms. You have countries like India, which has social media laws that enable the government to demand takedowns. How are those used? Well, it turns out they're used to take down political opposition, right? To block documentaries critical of the Modi government, to block activists in Canada critical of the Modi government. So the idea that government should have that power, I think, is deeply troubling because, again, there are authoritarian countries that will use that power in particular ways. On the flip side, the complete free-for-all, where the platform bears no responsibility, I also don't think has served us particularly well. I don't know that I have a good answer for you related to how to do it. I have tended, in my own alignment, to argue more for things like design, because I feel like it can have more impact more quickly, particularly also because in the United States, I just don't see a whole lot of potential for the Democrats and the Republicans to come together to pass legislation at all. So this is a topic that has kind of roiled us politically for the last 10 years. Ted Cruz had a Win Red fundraising page up, like, help me take on big tech, but then nothing materializes. Liz Warren has also introduced a bunch of bills.
Nothing materializes, I think, Renee, with Ted Cruz. So finally, the election's coming up. America is who knows who's going to win, but America at all sides are going to be inevitably roiled. I'm guessing that most of our audience want to be less roiled. Any short advice for parents, teachers, individuals out there in terms of fighting what you at least believe to be our invisible rulers, not rumors, invisible rulers, and fighting against these people or forces or governments who turn lies into reality?
Yeah.
Briefly, Renee.
Briefly, I think as stupid as it sounds, the think before you share guidance, I actually do think matters. I think this because I notice that whenever for me personally now, because I've been doing this for about 10 years, when I see something that makes me really outraged, I actually do not share it, because those are the ones where I'm like, okay, let me go check, let me go find some other sources and see if this is actually true. You see the clipped video and you're like, did that politician really say that thing? Is media accurately reporting on this? Is this influencer who clearly wants me to be outraged about it, is that video or that image selectively clipped? Like, I think it's actually counterintuitively, it is the times when you are most angry or that you have that strong emotional response where you should actually be seeing that as the moment where you actually go and check it out. That is, I think, those are the instances that matter, and I do wish that we could do a better job kind of emphasizing that to people, that they have the power to not get in the fight on the internet. You have the power to be less roiled, and I think we should be using it.
And are you sympathetic with hate and perhaps the Surgeon General that this media should come certainly with warnings, health warnings, especially for children?
It's such a difficult thing. I think I saw some people commenting, and we're here in California, the gosh, what is that proposition number? The one where every building you walk into in California, maybe it's 48, tells you that there's a cancer-causing chemical in the vicinity. And the net effect that has is that you stop paying attention because it is everywhere. So I'm not sure that warning labels per se make the most sense, but where I'm sympathetic with some of the stuff that John writes in particular is that I have 3 kids and my oldest is 10. And, getting him off screens feels arduous at times. Parents are looking for ways, I think, to teach their children how to engage, or better yet, disengage, honestly, even as the trends of the culture mean that he's more likely to be playing Fortnite with his friends with headsets on, sitting in their independent houses, than getting on their bikes and going to the playground together. And that, I do think, is actually sad. Like, that is the sort of thing where I do think it's not healthy for us as a society.
Well, Renee, I want to thank you. Best of luck with the new book. Always a delight to have such an original thinker on Keen On. Thank you so much.
Thank you.